All right. First we need to look at, when we're looking at Canada's participation in World War II, the first thing we need to look at is why did Canada enter the war? August 1st, Hitler invaded Poland. On August 10th, Canada declared war. So why did they wait over a week? Why did they wait these days before they committed to war? And what led them to commit war so closely to Great Britain's entry? So first thing we look at here is in 1939, Prime Minister Mackenzie King told Britain's High Commissioner, "We will take this stand on our own, not in any colonial attitude of mind, simply following the lead from England." Basically stating we're not going to just join this war because England is joining this war. We're not going to just follow Great Britain because we are a colony or in a colonial mindset, meaning that we still, although we are independent, act like a colony. Parliament was on a summer break, and he wanted to make sure the nation was united. So he did some work, did some speeches, and wanted to make sure that Canada would go into this war united, because there were some people that were against it. But doing some politicking over those 10 days allowed him to get most of the members of Parliament behind this. Most of the people of the Senate were behind this, and so the votes were very overwhelmingly for the war. Now, was this a practical delay, or was there really doubt on whether they wanted to join the war or not? Because if the case is we don't want to be a colonial mindset, then it really isn't. The reason for it is they're not sure. Or is it because of the practical issues of having Parliament back in session? They were at each other's throats after World War I, says Granstein, Canadian historian. So from day one, King's overriding goal was to take a united country into the war without bloodshed on the streets of Montreal. So the idea is wanted to avoid a conscription crisis, wanted to avoid the bitter feelings and bitter ideas that wound up kind of characterizing Canada's World War I experience. King told FDR that Canada had not decided. So FDR calls King up and says, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Are you guys joining the war with Great Britain, or are you holding out?" And King basically tells FDR, "I don't know. Canada's undecided." Now the question is, was King saying he was undecided because they really were undecided? Or is it because FDR had a sale of bombers? Okay? And so basically the Canada was buying bombers from the United States, and the sale of bombers would have had to be stopped if Canada said, "No, we're going to war." Because of the Neutrality Acts, FDR would have had to stop it. But in this case, by saying we're not sure yet, they were able to get these bombers from the United States. So why did Canada enter the war? One historian writes it basically, if you asked a Canadian at the time, should we support Great Britain, they would have said yes. And almost overwhelmingly yes, maybe with the exception of the French Canadians, but overwhelmingly yes. Then you would have asked him why, and he would have paused, because he's not sure. The main, I think, idea behind this, Granstein and one other Canadian historian's opinion, a guy by the name of Neatby, is that it was because of Canada finds its identity from Great Britain, finds its identity from the British because of the same laws, the same ideas, the same fundamental principles. And so when Great Britain went to war, Canada's identity as a nation forced it to follow. Canada, role in the war. So, background. What mistakes did Canada make during World War I that you think they needed to correct? Well, I think number one, we could say, you could pause this and come up with some ideas, but number one, we want to avoid the conscription crisis. Well, we got into the conscription crisis because Borden, on one hand, said no conscription. On the other hand, he committed 400,000 troops to Great Britain. They had large inflation and some economic problems after the war. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with all the veterans and the money that comes from the veterans? How do we deal with those issues? And the issues of British High Command making poor decisions. All of these were mistakes that were made during World War I, and Canada was responsible for most of them. So how do we correct it? Mackenzie King comes up with the plan of limited liability. That's how he plans on correcting this. Number one, to mobilize economy for war. King created the Department of Munitions and Supply in 1940, and this Department of Munitions and Supply worked much better than its counterpart in World War I. There wasn't any corruption. It was much more efficient. At the outset of war in 1939, King announced that Canadian forces would play 3 key roles. So his idea of limited liability was, if we don't put that many troops out there, if we don't send troops to Europe, except for one regiment or one division, if we don't send all of our troops there, then we're not at risk. So he said 3 roles that Canada would play. An infantry division would be sent to Europe. The Royal Canadian Navy would shepherd convoys across the Atlantic, and the Royal Canadian Air Force would run the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, called the BCATP. The role in World War II, as Germany quickly conquered virtually all of continental Europe by the summer of 1940.
There is a meeting.
All right. So Germany quickly conquered virtually all of continental Europe by the summer of 1940, and Canada basically had to jettison its limited liability idea or policy. And so basically they still wanted to create or stay limited, but they definitely wanted to make sure, and we're right here, wanted to make sure that they didn't commit too much. And that's King. King is a pragmatic politician. He doesn't want to overcommit Canada, overcommit his forces, overcommit his places, because he wants to be reelected. He doesn't have a lot of principles that he stands on, but he doesn't want to have to go back on the conscription promise that he makes again in World War II, and so therefore we want to move past that. Recruiting was stepped up. War production was increased to supply the British demand, and the units of infantry, artillery, and the Royal Canadian Air Force were hurried across the ocean. Now, there was a lot of people signing up for the armed forces. There was a lot of recruitment. It was quite easy to recruit men because there were still over 40,000 unemployed people. And so because of the large unemployment, because of the Great Depression that Canada still had not come out of, in 1939, many of them signed up to have a job. And not necessarily because of the patriotic need, but because they needed a job to feed themselves and to feed their families. And so a lot of them joined in order to do that. From 1939 until 1941, Canada was Britain's principal ally in the war effort. Canada produced much of the food, trained the pilots, escorted the goods across the Atlantic, to keep Britain in the war. Now, the United States obviously starts in 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act, supporting Great Britain much more, and Canada plays a lesser role in the support of Great Britain from that point on. But for the first 2 years of the war, or first year and a half of the war, Canada was Great Britain's principal ally. So, as you can look at this picture, you can see tank after tank after tank, all lined up, ready to go across the ocean. The first thing we're going to talk about is the industrial contribution of Canada towards the war, the economic contribution towards the war. Canada's gross national product, meaning all the goods and services in Canada during the war, went from 5.6 in 1939 to 11.9 billion in 1945. It more than doubled, or a little less than, I guess, more than doubled its industrial capacity, or all the goods and services that it was created. Built 29 new companies, included hundreds of new factories. They went from being a rather smaller country to one of, or a rather smaller economy that after World War II becomes a major industrial power. Canadian government spent over $22 trillion on the war in World War II. In 1941, over $500 million was given by the government to build manufacturing capacity. So the government did a lot of this helping build the aircraft and truck plants that Canada created. So over 500 million, and that shouldn't be 500,000, should be 500 million aside to help with capital growth. Canadian factory space went from 500,000 square feet to a high of 14 million So you could see the growth in industry, that although World War I started Canada on the process to become an industrialized power, that World War II is what really pushed Canada forward to become that industrial power. Within Canada, Ford and GM of Canada pooled their engineering design teams to produce a standardized vehicle for mass production, the CMP, the Canadian Military Police Truck, or private truck. So, produced over 850,000 motorized vehicles, 50,000 tanks, and armored gun carriers. So here is what they built during this time. You can see that Canada played a major role in providing aircraft, tanks, military vehicles, armored gun carriers, munitions, and small arms for the Allies and Great Britain and Canada. This wasn't just to equip their own soldiers, but to equip the soldiers of Great Britain. Another major issue and a big part of what Canada did. So Canada's Air Force goes from being like non-existent, and this is one of Canada's problems when we talk about military, is their military is pretty much non-existent before the war. They had 10,000 people in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army combined. I mean, that's really small. When they get over to the Army raises over to almost 2 million men. And so the Army, Navy, and everything together. And so you see that they go from being one of the smallest air forces to number 4 or 5, depending on when you looked. They were 5th there. They had the 4th largest Navy at the end of World War II. They went in with just 4 tribal class destroyers, or just a few destroyers. They come out. They built over 4,047 naval vessels, built 300 anti-submarine warships. Those are usually smaller, quicker cruisers and destroyers. 4 tribal-class destroyers, 410 cargo ships. They developed and used the radar that came from Great Britain. They had came up with a process for synthetic rubber and shared that with the United States. U.S. and Canada came together to create that synthetic rubber. And then they helped produce uranium, or dig uranium, for the Manhattan Project. This is one of the big issues, or one of the sad stories of World War II, is that people didn't realize what it was. And so these people on the ships were sitting on bags of uranium. If you know anything about nuclear materials, that's just a bad idea. And so many of those people died early of cancer and other problems. All right, part of the economic contribution was its work with the United States. King again visited FDR in Hyde Park in New York. And this was in 1941, after the United States declared Lend-Lease. And they came up with the Hyde Park Declaration. The USA agreed to buy more raw materials and manufactured goods in Canada. They also agreed to buy parts for military goods. So that Canada was building engines, so they would put the engines in the trucks that they would send to Great Britain. The aircraft, they would build the planes, and so they were buying pieces from Canadian manufacturing to put into U.S. plants and to send that to Lend-Lease. They were also just buying products from Canada to then send to Great Britain. Because up until this point, Great Britain was paying for things from Canada, and Canada was giving them money to help pay for this. But basically, they were producing. So all of a sudden, the U.S. was going to jump in with this Lend-Lease Act and cut Canada out. So King went to FDR. They created this Hyde Park Declaration that kept Canada economically sound into the war. Allow components to be imported into Canada under Lend-Lease, and then built there and then sent. Why did the Hyde Park Declaration matter for Canada? Struggling economy, still hurting from the Depression, turned into a booming economy. Without the Hyde Park Declaration, they might have been cut out of Lend-Lease, and you would have seen a huge downturn in the Canadian economy, despite the fact that they were still at war. So this was definitely a good idea. Canada gave away billions of dollars in munitions and foodstuff. Canada gave specifically to Great Britain $3.5 billion in aid over time. So, a couple of the mistakes that were made economically. The Government Economic Advisory Committee buys American coal rather than develop Canadian mines for the same process. So instead of Canada made some mistakes here. Instead of buying the cheaper American coal, they should have given grants to start the mining in Canada, which would have further developed their economy. Department of Munitions created 28 Crown corporations as private corporations. Were not doing the job. They needed to probably have more control over those corporations and keep them government-owned until after the war. So that is what Canada's economic contribution. Now to look at one of its other big contributions, and that's the British Commonwealth Air Training and the Battle of Britain. We're going to basically end it after we talk about this. So, number 2 Training Command, headquarters in Winnipeg. You notice that it was all over Canada. And they did different things here: building plants, training squadrons, training instrument flight school, beginning flight school. Basically, almost all the pilots that were used in the war were trained in Great Britain. The Royal Canadian Air Force sent 41 squadrons overseas because it also trained its own, but other Canadians volunteered directly for the Royal Air Force. By the end of the war, Canada had the 4th largest air force in the world. Canada was the primary location of the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. Through this program, it was the largest Air Force training program in history. 131,000 of 553 Air Force personnel, including almost 50,000 pilots, were trained at air bases in Canada from October 1940 to March 1945. More than half of the graduates were Canadians who went on to serve either with the Royal Air Force or with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And 1 out of 6 RAF Bomber Group command groups was Canadian. And so we could see, or Canadian trained, and we could see that this had a huge impact because of the impact of Air Force in the war. Air Force made a huge impact. The power of the Air Force, the amount of the Air Force air power in World War II, and so this training program in Canada made a big difference. Now, there's a big difference between the plan and what actually happened. We could see that in the areas that the training program ended March 31st, 1945, and although they had planned on training over 100,000 pilots, they didn't quite get there, but they did train people from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Royal Air Force from Great Britain. Newfoundland, France, Poland, and other nations at war with Germany also benefited from this training program. And so this was one of the major contributions of Canada, was this training program where they were training pilots and creating pilots so that they could then be a part of the war effort. So this is all we have for part 1. We will look at the naval contributions and their actual service in the war in the next half of this podcast.